So, Rav Yitz, I'm going to ask you to start us off and to share a little bit of your understanding of how we got to this moment, what we face in terms of the growing distinctions and divergences between American Jews and Israeli Jews, and your opening thoughts on where you think we go from here.
Thank you. Of course, I'll start by acknowledging and thanking Tzipi Livni for a very important statement. I won't go over all her details, but just to add, I think perhaps the most important message beyond the details is just that American Jews have to know that we have in the leadership and in the shaping people of the state of Israel a real desire to connect, a real desire to share and to be part of one people, and perhaps that message may be just as important as all the other very important points that you made. So thank you for that.
Thanks.
I want to start by, at least since the day will be very much American Jews speaking to Israelis and vice versa, I want to make one statement if I can put myself in the position of speaking from the perspective of the whole Jewish people, not of two communities speaking to each other. But if we look at it, if we step back and look from the perspective of the one Jewish people and what's going on, in particular in relation to Israel. When modern Zionism started 140 years ago or so, it was modernity, the challenge of this new, attractive, magnetic, wonderful civilization that was leading to major upgrading of human condition throughout the world, that had this tremendous extra promise to the Jewish people, equality, citizenship, and end to discrimination, and to Jewish penalty. It was irresistible and powerful. And the big question was, how can the Jewish people enter this culture, this civilization, without losing its own identity and its own values and its own purposes? And the truth is that 10% of the Jewish people, or roughly 10%, said you can't. We have to stay out of it. If we get involved, we'll be totally assimilated. That 10% has continued and persisted to this day, trying to stay out of engagement with the modern world and with all the complications and negatives in that. Of the 90%, I would say maybe 2 to 5% said the solution is taking from modernity, its idea of taking charge of one's life. One could go back to the state of Israel, the homeland. One can create a geographical place where the Jews are concentrated, where they're the culture, they're the calendar, they're the dominant language. And this way, Jewish identity and the Jewish people can be preserved. But we're talking the Chalutzim, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 of a worldwide Jewish population of 18 million. So it was the smallest of percentages that thought Zionism was a serious and immediate option, or willing to give their lives for it. 85% of the Jewish people more or less decided that the way the future is as a minority, living among a majority that's not Jewish. Can we create a distinctive version of the religion? That's, of course, the liberal movements or modern Orthodox. Can we create some sort of distinctive Jewish culture, whether the secular or the Yiddishist? Whether we can modify Jewish identity or in some way recreate it so that it can maintain itself while participating, while integrated in the total civilization that was around us and that was drawing us into it. So it's looking back at this 140 years, I want to point out, I think it's very important from the Jewish perspective. If the test of history was, how can we assure the Jewish future, we have to take seriously what happened and appreciate what happened, the amazing thing that happened. And that is that in these 140 years, that 2%, that 20, 30, 40,000, has become a state of 8 million people, 50% of the total Jewish population of the world. That in that 140 years, the diaspora has gone from 16 or 18 million to 9 million, in half. And so again, in terms of just the capacity, and it's not a settled issue by any means, and don't get me wrong, I remain full of hope that this vision is realizable, that we can develop a Jewish culture and a Jewish identity that can maintain itself in the presence of the whole world and in the presence of the majority as it needs to, and that we will not have a Torah of a shelter or of a ghetto, but a Torah that is really fully integrated and perhaps even a leading, shaping force in world civilization. But at least have to stop and recognize what actually has happened in this 140 years. the miracle not just of the state of Israel itself, but of an economy that was dependent on help from around the world, and a very minor thing into a major economic force, into, as you've heard, a world technology center, a world educational center, a world cultural creative center. And that, so I think American Jews in particular, or I should say perhaps world Jews, have to really stop and appreciate not only the miracle, but that it's more greater than the specific issues of political or even internal conflicts within the Jewish people. That's what the Jewish people has accomplished. And if one is talking about the future of the Jewish people, the answer is that the diaspora still doesn't have a model that we know for sure will maintain itself. Israel has, because it's a more standard model. Most religions in the world existed not in diaspora and not by persecution and by internal ghettoization. They existed because they're the standard national culture and national calendar, national language. Be that whatever the reason is, for the moment, I think American Jews need to address Israel with both wonder, respect, and appreciation for that accomplishment. And again, with pride, because the Jewish people has come back from the ultimate experience of degradation and death and created the greatest outburst of life, creativity, culture, vitality of its history and perhaps of human history, and that is part of the pride and the identification that each of us should feel, and that transcends the temporary unity around Israel of the 48. I think this is a unity and a vision that transcends and grows out of the heart of Jewish existence and Jewish identity. The second major point I wanted to make was about the reality of the time we're living in. The central question of Jewish religion and of Jewish history and of Jewish peoplehood is the Jewish people's attempt to take power. And again, it came after the Holocaust, when not only the Jews, the whole world learned the lesson that because of the dynamic and the power unleashed in modern civilization, existence as a powerless minority living on tolerance is not possible and is not acceptable morally or humanly. It's not just the Jews who learned that. In the last 50 years since the Holocaust, we've had African-American liberation movements, we've had gay liberation, we've had women's liberation, we've had third world liberation. In other words, everybody woke up to the same truth, that you have to have the capacity to defend and protect yourself, to assert your own dignity, and not have to depend on the goodwill, which even in the case of the Allies and the democracies of World War II was simply lacking when the Jews needed them. So in a very real sense, this is the central question and central challenge. How do we take power? And of course, creating the state of Israel, Ben-Gurion, that was his greatness, that he was willing to risk literally being wiped out because the British General Staff, General Marshall, the Secretary of State of America, told him that if you declare the state, you will be invaded and you'll be destroyed. Our best military judgment was, we're not going to help you and you're going to go under. But he was willing to take that risk because he understood for Jews there was no choice. In order to live, in order to become, in order to resume the vision of that final perfection that Jews are committed to, that Jews had to have the power, which in the contemporary world comes only through national existence and sovereignty. And so he took that risk and accomplished it. But of course, that's not just an Israeli question. The Jewish people taking power for its own dignity, for its own creativity, for its own capacity, is the central question of diaspora Jewry as well. And for a long time, we tried to avoid that, and to this day, Jews try very hard sort of to deny that there's Jewish interest and Jewish political power, and to some extent, have been uncomfortable with the fear of being labeled as dual loyalty, etc. But the bottom line is that is the central question. And again, we have to look at Israel, and this came from secular Jews. It did not come from the official tradition, let's be honest about it. Established a military ethic, an ethic of power, of sovereignty, that has really been remarkable. Serious flaws like any human enterprise. It's a democracy with limitations in which the minority does not have full equality yet, in which multiple discrimination forms exist. But at the same time, we have incredibly set a standard, including in military, and despite the presence I remember the famous story of Justice William Brennan visiting in the 1980s, who said what had struck him the most about his visit to Israel was, here's a state which has been under siege, facing terrorism for 50 years at the time. He said, and in America, like in any democracy, when you're under siege and when you're threatened, there's almost a natural closing in, shrinking some of the civil liberties, shrinking some of the human rights issues, simply be out of self-defense or out of closing ranks. He said what struck him was that Israel had managed in these 40, 50 years not only to maintain, but to widen, that the Arab minority was treated better in the 1980s than it was in the 1940s, that the Supreme Court, its influence was only growing as a balance and as a protection of minority rights. So again, I feel the Israeli army in the same way. One of the failures we have failed on is to allow the hijacking of the Zionist narrative and the representation of Israel's army and its military ethic as less than what it is, which is one of the highest standards in the world. So the second challenge, as I said, of taking power is, the fact is, in taking that power, and it's very natural, you give up innocence, you have civilian casualties, you have side effects, you end up making compromises in who you ally with and some of the policies you follow. This is what happens when you are in power and not simply an idealistic system. And I want to, again, criticize myself, or if you will, the American Jewish left in particular, because I come from the left and I identify with it, that I think we have too often judged Israel by a kind of standards of powerlessness, by the standards of ideal perfection, which are simply impossible in the real world. And I think part of the reason we allowed the hijacking of the narrative is that we were not strong enough to be willing to say that, and not strong enough to speak up to our own allies when they became, not all of our allies, but some, when they became radicalized, and we've had this double standard, growing double standard, not just of anti-Zionism, but a kind of, it starts with that oppressed people or people of color, by definition, cannot sin or cannot be wrong, and it's white privilege, and Israel is a white privileged country, that automatically must be wrong in this matter. Well, it turns out when you go that route, you end up tolerating or accepting further radicalization that misrepresents and lies openly, or that defames, or that, in fact, turns into anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism. And instead of checking that from day one, and no one can check it from the outside, one of the weaknesses of American Jewish response is that much of the opposition has been funded by the extreme right or by the most pro-settling. That's a mistake. The internal criticism can only come credibly from people who are part of the very internal left, and including the people who are legitimately and accurately criticizing these flaws or these mistakes, or who are standing on guard against the natural abuse that grows as you exercise power. So my second comment is that we as American Jews have a major responsibility to become more realistic in our moral judgments, more willing in that realism speaking to Israel because we care, because it's one people, because it's not just what Israel does that reflects on Israel, it becomes the definition of what the Jewish people are. Because we are trying to uphold these classic values, we acknowledge that the Israelis have applied them better and in more dramatic ways than we have, but we'd like to match you, we'd like to participate with you, and we'd like to help you protect against the extremes that power tends to go to, and power does corrupt. We'd like to work on that together, and so it comes not as a criticism or as a delegitimation, it comes as I'm in this with you, and I am as affected as you are. And I would add to that that it becomes very important from our perspective then to literally interchange with Israel. Joel Chasnoff said it quite humorously, but of course the fact is that Chayalim Bodedim, that they're American Jews, one of our grandsons who came as volunteers, his parents live in this country, but who came and joined the IDF, or the fact that there are thousands of Jewish young people studying and participating and living in the land of Israel who will come back to America. But I think this becomes important that we multiply those numbers, which brings me to the third sort of general point I want to make about this too. that, again, we have to not think of it as just two communities competing, or who's right or who's wrong, or who is the future of the Jewish people, but really to see Israel as a resource. 50 years ago, we was unified, but we're unified because we had to protect Israel, we had to fight for it, we had to help it. And I don't want to underestimate that job. That job of keeping America politically on Israel's side is a major responsibility. And again, it's very troubling, and part of the blame is on the Israeli government. That is, as we heard from our speaker, Tzipi Livni, that it was allowed to be, or it's been allowed to be turned into, or partially turned into, a partisan, one party. I think it's a serious mistake, but that's a job that we have to do in America even more than the Israeli government. I'm hopeful that there will be a bit more help from that government in the next round. But at this point, it's part of our responsibility to go back into the Democratic Party, into the liberal circles where 80% of American Jews are found, and there in that framework speak up again and to fight for the recognition that in fact in the end, when you have this kind of false moral structure, you end up in the name of intersectionality, you prohibit Zionists from marching in a gay parade, when in fact Israel not only has gay liberation, Israel, Tel Aviv, as you saw, won the award as the most gay-friendly city in the world, and you end up criticizing or attacking them in the name of Hamas or a PA where gay people are thrown off roofs and in which they are so persecuted that they have to flee to go to Israel. So again, there's a moral skewing in the left which we have to correct, and we have to correct for the sake of the left, for the sake of liberalism. If you allow me two other quick points, I'll make them a little faster if I can. Third is that Israel is a major resource for our future and a major opportunity. I think the classic example we have ready is in Birthright, where the experience of visiting Israel, and it's not the wall and it's not Mossad, although they're part of it. I think it's, if you study the analyses afterward, it's the nightclubs in Tel Aviv too. It's the first time that many of them have experienced Judaism and Jewish people as a living culture, alive, vital, dynamic, not just a classic history, not just a great tradition, but really alive, creative, with popular music and all kinds of thousands of details of technology and contemporary life. And that is electrifying, because suddenly Judaism is alive, you're part of a living, creative, dynamic people, and not just part of a great classic tradition. That is a classic example of Israel as a resource, but it could be and should be much more of a resource than we've used it now. I'll give one example, of course, is Masa. The government has funded more extended study in Israel. What has not happened, however, is what happened in the Orthodox community, has been a tremendous resource in America, has not been done by the non-Orthodox community, and it's time it did it, which is the Orthodox starting 50 years ago, 60, 70 years ago. One project at a time developed multiple ways of spending a year studying in Israel. People forget my wife, one of the first, Blue is one of the first cohorts that went there. When they went there, it was a handful of people in the whole country, from the Orthodox community, that went for 6 months. It was very daring, and for girls particularly, sort of a little bit disreputable, but it started. By now, there are so many multiple versions of what you want to do and how you study and how you live in Israel that 80% of the community at graduating high school spends that year in Israel, and they come back enriched Jewishly, they come back enriched personally, they come back connected. Well, I would say what we need is that the non-Orthodox community and the Federation and the secular community have to build and underwrite, send educators and underwrite them multiple ways of studying, living, working in Israel for that 6 months or a year.
Rabbi
And that will revolutionize their future.
Okay, Rabbi Yitz? Rabbi Yitz?
My final point is something that Tzipi...
Rabbi Yitz, I'm going to have to exercise a difficult moderator's privilege and ask Dr. Gavison to interrupt, so thank you.
Thank you.
In a way, it's nice to be last because I can agree with most of what we already heard and continue. But I am not going to take this easy way out because I want to start with actually making our challenge a bit more troubling before I go back to the line that I do share, that there is a sense in which this is one people with two or more centers, and it needs to find a way to work together in order to make the one people thrive. But before I get there, let me say why the unique history of the one Jewish people has created actually a problem that is more difficult than I think we heard until now. The problem within communities of finding a balance between effectiveness, solidarity, cohesiveness, and difference, pluralism, diversity, is not a unique problem to Jews. It's a problem that exists for every community, religious, cultural, and political. For political communities, we usually recommend democracy. And democracy usually works in a way that we call constitutional democracy. The people agree and accept that they have differences, deep differences, on economics, on religion versus enlightenment, on being Jews, Muslims, Christians, or Americans, Germans, whatever, black, white, you take it. People have these differences. And we want to create a stable political community out of communities with difference of identities and interests. We need to find a way of making them have a shared interest of working towards their growth together, and this is the solidarity, the shared values part, while allowing the continuing differences to create the kind of mobility and energy and moving forward that only controversy, only disagreement can generate. Federalist number 10. Civics 1-0, okay? Okay, so this is true for all of us. And this is true for all states. And successful constitutions do just that. But successful constitutions, if they really want to maintain diversity, need to be thin. They cannot define into the Constitution the whole range of possible answers to the different controversies. So a constitution, by definition, will have to be based on rules of procedure, how to decide when there is disagreement, how to manage continuing disagreements, and despite that, regard yourself as one collective working together. And this is a serious issue for many states, and today it's a very serious for this country, and for my country, and for many other countries. Brexit is, I think, a good reminder. So this is a general problem of countries that do not find a way of using rules of the game to enable them to overcome an extremely serious disagreement. Now, Israel has this problem over at least 3 issues. It cannot use its rules of the game to solve it. One is the future of the territories, now primarily the West Bank. One is relations, state and religion for Jews, but not only Jews within Israel. And the third is the status of the Arab minority. These are all issues that Israel is struggling with. I think I agree that Israel is struggling with in an impressive way. This is not apartheid, this is not, all of this is, the people who know Israel know that all these derogatory descriptions are simply not true. It's not a theocracy, and it's not this, and it's making moves, and there is a lot of living together, and it's very impressive, but it cannot resolve them and go forward. So this is very problematic because it polarizes society. The politicization of the political community in Israel that is not only Jewish, defined as Jewish and democratic, but has 20% are not Jews, all of this means that Israel cannot rely on its constitutional shared values to resolve its difficulties. And this is a very serious problem for Israel. I don't see how it is solved. It can only be mitigated. Now we are talking about the relationship between Israel, a state with this kind of problem, and Jewish communities abroad. Now, Jewish communities abroad, this is the biggest, flourishing one, very diverse, it's fine. Let's talk about the US, but Jewish communities abroad never had the kind of decision-making mechanism that Israel as a state had to have. So when we talk about a conversation, between whom are we talking? Now, one of the great challenges of the Jews outside of Israel is precisely to know who is within the tent and who is outside the tent. You have huge debates about this question, and they cannot be resolved in part because all your structure is voluntary and has no real forces that are state or money. But this is a limitation and a strength that we in Israel don't have, because in Israel, all religions, not only Judaism, all religions are institutionalized and state-based, so that we can have in Israel what you are fortunate enough not to have, which is an Orthodox or even ultra-Orthodox monopoly over marriage, divorce, conversion, burial, kosher food, all these things that are terrible to Israelis, but also terrible to the relations between Israel and the diaspora, which thinks that Jews should define themselves, their attitude to ongoing, developing a dynamic Judaism, as they should, in Israel as well as in the diaspora. So I think that the Jewish people trying to define its solidarity vis-a-vis its challenges has some known problems and some unique problems that I don't think we have sufficiently addressed. Because what we have said here, which I think is very important, is critical. It is indeed critical for Jews in Israel to acknowledge the ongoing legitimacy, importance, vitality, and part of the Jewish peoplehood of Jewish communities elsewhere. The tendency among some Israelis to think that the Israeli Jewish people is the only authentic Jewish people, and Israeli Jews should only rely on the Jewish diaspora for money or help or support or lobbying. This is an instrumental, unpleasant, unattractive, and misunderstanding of the basic root of Zionism as an attempt to give a different way of life to those Jews all over the world who choose to live in the only majority Jewish state in the world. And this relationship is therefore enduring. But the challenge is also a challenge for the Jewish community outside of Israel, because you want to be larger, so you want to have more Jews in your campus, which is fine and understandable. But you also need to find out, how do you identify those people who at least would like to remain Jewish and transmit their Jewishness? Because you do have a problem here that when you live as a minority community among another host community, there is a real question, a legitimate question. Why should your Jewish identity, or the component of Jewish identity, more important, more primary, or maybe even conflicting with your civic identity where you are? So for Jews in Israel, the question is, should we be Jews first or Israeli first? Not a trivial question, definitely not for the Arabs, but not even for some Jews. But the question for Americans or English or Mexican Jews is, are we Jews first or American first? And when we are American first, our commitments to political sides in America maybe they should not be corrected by the fact that we are Jewish and our allies in the cultural, political wars in America go and conflict with other things. And now the other point, which I think is very problematic. The option, I think, for Israel is to say the Jewishness of the state is inclusive religiously, but identifying nationally, culturally, and historically, which is fine. It's not only possible, it's the right way to go historically and ideologically. But for Jews outside of Israel, Jews who chose not to go to Israel, usually the identification as a part of a Jewish nation is very problematic, and rightly so. Citizenship, nation, ethnicity, what is all of this about? So it's easier to be identified as Jews as a religion. But when you are identified as Jew as a religion and you want to be liberal, then your fight against orthodoxy is very different from the kind of fight against orthodoxy which a traditional or an atheist Jew in Israel would like to be. And the structural differences are very important. So I think that what we have in Israel, and what you may have here in present Republican, Democratic, Orthodox, non-Orthodox Judaism, are parts of deeper problems because of the different ways we are institutionalized, and this is inevitable. It's not something that is accidental. So the Supreme Court issue in Israel is not only about halakha, Jewish law versus the rule of law. It's not at all that. It's also a real debate about who decides. Elected officials, the majority, which tends to be now a bit more right-wing in Israel than it used to be 20 or 30 years ago, or the philosopher kings, the judges. So this is not only about religion versus, this is also about something that we hear about in Hungary and Turkey and things like that. So what can we do in order to make sense of our need to frame solidarity with difference among the Jewish people? So first of all, I agree with what was said here before. It's very important to see that diaspora and Israel are two different forms of Jewish life, which are both important, I think critical to Jewish thriving, but different in important ways. So solutions to state and religion issues that are applicable in the United States are not necessarily applicable in Israel. The demos in Israel is different than the demos of the Jewish people outside of Israel in various places. And the demos of the Israeli Jewish population has more power, as it should have in Israeli democracy, than the various position of power within the Jewish community outside Israel. This is something that needs to be respected. Jewish democracy needs to be respected even if the power of government is now in the hands of the camp that you tend to disagree with. This is part of a commitment to democracy. I'm not only a Democrat when my party rules, I'm a Democrat specifically when the other party rules, but I want to make sure that they don't undermine the rules of the game, which is some people do. So what do we do about that danger? And I will conclude here because we are running short on time here. What can we do about that? So I think constitution makers can be smart. I think, for instance, term limits is something that looks neutral, looks nonpartisan, is neutral, and is very helpful in the democratic quest for change of power as a guarantee of freedom. We don't have it. Turkey had it, but it was undermined. Hungary possibly doesn't have it. Countries that don't have term limits for people in power are at risk of becoming autocracies. This is something that is now happening in Israel. I think it's a danger. It should be dealt with not on a partisan level, not on the substance, and as far as I'm concerned, not through criminal prosecutions. This is something that I've been saying for 20 years now, so this is not about our present politics. The other important thing, critical as far as I'm concerned, is the strength of a real democratic. It's not only about Jewish, actually it's more about democratic. Tocqueville is Federalist 10, Tocqueville is still very relevant. Political constraints and political agendas are vulnerable and do lead to concentrations of powers and abuse of powers despite all efforts. A strong democracy can only work with a very powerful civil society. And this is where the importance of the relationship between Israel as a Jewish state, Israel as a Jewish and non-Jewish society with a very strong civil society and NGO world, the American Jewish community with exceptionally system of strong voluntary tradition. These are the elements that can and should be enlisted to remedy the excesses of the political checks and balances that aim to do the right thing and protect our democracy, but sometimes erode and fail. So it is within our hands. And we are here together because we do care, but we should care wisely and appreciate the challenges that are before us. Thank you.
So, unfortunately, it appears that the opportunity to moderate this session has diminished. I'll share with you just a couple of the questions that I wanted to ask you, and then we're going to break up the session. And I'm going to share those questions because maybe they could be useful for participants in coming to speak to you about these questions and to fuel the rest of our time together. Tzipi, you spoke a lot about engaging young people, especially about here in America. And I think it's a part of one of the questions that I think we have to work on and think about is what happens when even engaging the next generation of American Jews and Israeli Jews is actually splits along a political divide. Young Israelis tend to be more right-wing than their parents. Young American Jews tend to be more left-wing politically than their parents. So even the challenge of the next generation creates some polarizations. Yitz, you spoke so powerfully about the revolution in Jewish history in which we're living and the opportunity to shift our dynamic around the morality of power. And I am curious to know from you and for us to continue to explore when we cross the threshold of power as it's exercised too problematically. Right? You talked about the moral urgency of taking ourselves and our dignity and our self-preservation seriously. But then there's the other alternative, and obviously occupation and its challenges puts that right in front of us. And Ruth, I think it's in your conversation, in your talk about democracy and constitutionalism, one of the questions that lingers for me is how do we balance the right of diaspora Jews to be in conversation with Israelis and Israeli societies relative to the needs of the non-Jewish minorities in Israel? And my fear sometimes that we're talking about building relationships with Israel that might leapfrog what it means for Israel to engage with its actual minorities who are not American Jews, who don't choose to live there, but actually are its citizens. Anyway, I think those are good questions. I wish there was an opportunity to engage them, but please join me in thanking our speakers today.